The whole book of Romans to explain something of who we are in Christ and how Christ wants us to respond with that. Romans is interesting. As we've been reading through it, we have heard some really deep doctrine about what God has done for us that we might be saved. We've talked about how God has called us from even beginning before the creation of the earth. He knew us and He has created us to have a relationship with Him. And Paul has talked about how knowing that is supposed to change the way we understand ourselves and the way we interact with others. And finally, as we get into this chapter, chapter 12, Paul changes from thinking theologically about who God is and who we are in Christ to start to put that into practical sense about how we're supposed to live that out in our lives. And so he talks and centers on this concept of love as the core piece for who we are as Christian believers. Do you believe that? That love should be a core piece of who we are as Christians? You know, Christ said to His followers, He said, "They shall know that you are my followers because of the amount of money that you have." He said, "You will be my followers and everyone will know it because you will have the greatest churches and all the wonderful structure and architecture around." No, it was because of your love for one another. And it was said of the early church that even though they faced persecution day and night, the secular authors and the atheists at the time, they looked to the Christians and they said, if it were not for the fact that they loved each other daily, they would have been cast out or wiped out years ago. But because of their unconditional love that they showed one another, their numbers grow daily. Could you imagine what it would look like if love truly was the core piece of everything that we do as a church? If people they walked by the church and they said, you know, I know not anything about the programs or the agenda or anything about that church, but man, those people, they just love each other. They love to love. You know, they are an example of what love is all about. I have a feeling that if that was what was known about this church, we would have to put gates on the doors because we'd have so many people wanting to be a part of that kind of fellowship. Because that is the core piece of who we are as a church, is that this core idea of love. One is the love that we have received from God, but then the love that we then extend to others is supposed to be the pinnacle piece of who we are as believers. And as we think about that, I've described that as a language of love. That as a church we need to learn how to talk in a way that's different than the way we've been taught by the world. And as we speak with one another and as we use those words should be transformed. Instead of using the words of hate or self-preservation or self-aggrandizement that the world would teach us, we are supposed to be using the words that Christ gives us, which are words of love. And so I want us to think about that in the text of what we have just read and how that can be affected in our concept of what love is. And the first section that we read, it talks about love as an attitude. Love should change and be a part of our attitude. You know, so often in our culture when people talk about love, they talk about love in terms of, you know, they fell into love. Or they fell out of love. As if love is some sort of weird ditch that you're walking along in life and then suddenly you fell into it. Or you fell out of it. And, you know, we talk about this in the sense of, well, they no longer had love for each other. You know, it was this wonderful experience of all this sort of Gucci, coochie type of things that we had. You know, when I was in grade school, we talked about having cooties, and maybe love was kind of like this cooties, like somebody caught it, and then somebody gave it to somebody else, and it was sort of contracted. This, you know, Marcia's not here, so we think there's some sort of antiviral for the cooties that was out there. But Scripture talks about love in a very different kind of way. It talks about love as an attitude, as a choice that we make. As I look at couples who've been married for a very long time, and I think Estel and Lois Grubb are a great example of this, is that love is something that they chose. They chose to be in relationship with one another. And never in their thought was there the idea that somehow, if it doesn't feel right today, if I don't feel in love with you, that I'm no longer married, right? You chose, and you continue to make that choice. For us as the church, we recognize that love is the core piece of what God has done for us. Because of His love for us, we choose to love others. And it really is an attitude of the heart. This is why He says, let your love be genuine. Because love can have lots of different degrees of love. We can choose to love selfishly. That is, I can choose to love you only as much as it's going to benefit me. Right? I'm going to love you enough until you like me enough to give me the stuff I need. That's selfish love. And I think a lot of the world's idea of love is kind of on this selfish idea that I'm going to love you just enough to make you like me enough to get me what I want. The tricks that I play on my partners, as it was described in a movie not too long ago. Love is supposed to be genuine. That is, in the description of Paul, love is supposed to not be hypocritical. And that word hypocritical is from the Greek concept of the mask that was worn during the Greek plays. He said, love isn't supposed to be a mask that you wear. It's supposed to be genuine. It's supposed to be true to who you are. And therefore, he says, love should be genuine and true, and you should hate what is evil and hold fast to what is good. And what he's talking about with evil, the core concept of evil is to tear down. The core concept of good is to build up. And so the concept of love being genuine is that as we look to one another, our concept should be, how do I help benefit the other person next to me? How do I help to increase their life rather than to tear it down? Or even just to walk away from it. The question for love to be genuine is, as I understand it, as we see each other as a Christian community, I'm supposed to be motivated to choose to help the other person around me in love to increase or benefit their life. That is the core meaning of what love is all about. Love is not supposed to be just considering how do I put on a nice face or smile and say, oh, we'll pray for your situation today. You know, we get enough of that. The question is, are we going to be able to take that next step and see if we can actually help in each other's lives? You know, not just in a sort of meddling sort of way. He describes it in this way. He says, love one another with mutual affection. And that idea of mutual affection is the term that he's describing as family love. Now, I wonder if you've had family, and all of us have family of some sort or another, even if it was just a mother or just a father. We've all had family at some point in our lives. Now, many of our families were somewhat dysfunctional, right? There was a level of love or trust, but then after that, it just kind of fell off, right? But all of us have experienced love in different degrees. But in a family that works without dysfunction, there is supposed to be this concept of trust, where you're able to share honestly about your joys, your concerns, your struggles, and people care about each other. And that is what he's describing as the mutual affection of the church. Is that as we come into the church together, as we, not just the building, but we come in as members of Christ's body together, we honestly care and mutually care for each other's concerns. So we are to have this sort of family idea. We are all brothers and sisters. And recognizing that our ideas that have been given to us by families of origin that have fallen short of the ideal, those are not God's best for us, right? But instead, God has given us a brand new family. We often talk about the fact that when we come into a relationship with God, God transforms our vertical relationship with Him. He has forgiven us of our sin. We no longer have to hold ourselves guilty or ashamed because of those activities in our lives. But there's a second dimension to the cross, and that is a horizontal dimension. Not only has God placed us within a new vertical relationship with Him, but He's also placed us in a new horizontal relationship with each other. By placing us not only in the family of origin, He's placed us into a new family, that is the church. A place in which we are to care and love for one another, to help to heal the bounds and the brokenness that sometimes has been inflicted in our life experiences. What would that look like for the church to really share love with one another in a way that's a healing, mutually affectionate kind of way? I think these are the kind of ideas that Paul would like us to think about. He that says we should try to outdo each other in the way that we honor one another. We should outdo each other in ways that we can honor one another. Now this is different than when you go into a marketplace or if you were to work in a business. The whole idea with that is how do you get ahead of the next guy? Perhaps if you find some flaw in that other character, you exploit that flaw so that they can be torn down. That is the world's model of what it looks like to interact. But within the church, he says, try to outdo each other in honoring one another. That is, when you find somebody in our church who is in need of help or somebody who feels low, you do your best to encourage them, to boast them, to build them up. And this is how we honor one another. Paul describes it in Corinthians in this way. He says, all of us are like members of the body. Some have greater honor than others, but all of us are essential and bound together as in one body together. And those characters that we think have least honor, we need to elevate because they are essential. In the same way that a chain that even has a weak link, that weak link has to be treated with special care, because it is at that weak link that the entire strength of that chain is measured. In the church, we are all together, honoring one another, and as we do so, we build the entire church as we support and love and care for one another. So we recognize that love is an attitude. We can choose what we do with our love. We can choose to love one another. We can choose to love unconditionally. We can choose to love in the caring kind of way that Paul describes, or we can choose to love in a selfish way. But rather, it is an attitude that we must choose to love each other daily. The second way that love affects us is that love has an impact in our time, in the way that we utilize our time. And the way he describes that for the church is he says we must zealously and ardently love one another. And the description of this is that the words he's using is of the same words as when you put a pot of water on and it begins to boil. It's at that boiling point that it transforms from just the liquid into the gas. You know, my son and I have been describing science together, trying to figure this out. And we discovered condensation the other day. When you have ice and you have, the gas finally getting condensed on the side of the glass, it becomes water again. He said, oh, that's the reverse of the boiling point. And I said, that's cool. I didn't put those together before I had a 5-year-old. Somehow 5-year-olds make sense of science for us. But what he's talking about is in the church, the love should be at such a boiling point that as we experience faith and as we experience this life together, it is able to instantaneously move us from a position of just being where we are to action. We should be ready in the moment's notice to respond to the needs that are around us. We should keep our faith at such a boiling point that we are ready and willing to respond instantaneously. This is the description of zealously and ardently keeping time with God. The second part about time is it says we are supposed to serve the Lord. And what's interesting, in many translations it doesn't say serve the Lord, it says we are to serve the time. And what's happening is there's actually a word play that's happening here, because the word for time that is being used is the kairos time. Not talking about the chronos of the clock, but a kairos dealing with the season of the church, a season of what God is doing in our lives. And he says we are to take hold of those opportunities, of those seasons that God has put before us. Now I wonder, as you think about it, how many times has the Lord provided for you an opportunity to demonstrate His love or His kindness? And just think about those opportunities for a moment. How many times has the Lord provided an opportunity to respond in those opportunities? Now think about how many of you have taken that opportunity to use that to God's glory, to really respond, to take the fullness of that time. Now, like most of us, I know that my record is a bit spotty. There are times I've said, yes, Lord, I am ready. You have provided this opportunity, and I'm jumping in. I'm ready to put aside my time, my agenda, and everything else, and just do what you've called me to do. But I know there are a lot of times when I'm like, well, but my 8 o'clock TV show is about to get on, and I'd rather do this. And there have been times I have definitely missed that opportunity. But what he's describing about our time is that in our time, we are to recognize the fullness of God's call in our lives, so that every moment of every time we are to keep our faith at such a point that we're ready to respond with our lives. Now, the interesting thing about being ready is that we don't have to wait for a great crisis in order to be ready. In order for us to be ready to respond, we need to be prepared in our hearts now. The ability to become great isn't just being able to respond in the moment of crisis, but it comes from being prepared all the time through, so that when a crisis does occur, then we have available to us the resources in order to respond to that occasion. This is actually why I think it's so great in the Methodist Church that we're working together to do this health fair. Is that as the Methodist churches together, we are putting together in place those resources and those ways that we can respond to the needs of those around us, so that when there is a need, when something happens, we are ready. We are able to say, yes, here it is. And in the United Methodist Church, we've put together what's called the United Methodist Committee on Relief. They're not just waiting around for a catastrophe and then asking for funds. They are already ready in case of the next natural disaster to show up on the doorstep when the earthquake dissipates or when the tornado goes through. They are there on the ground the next moment that is available in order to provide relief. This is part of how the church responds in care and compassion to the needs of the world. by keeping our hearts at that time to recognize that the fullness of time is now, and that we're able to respond in loving care with that. And he says then, also dealing with time, is that we have hope. That in our hope we are to rejoice. We rejoice in hope. We recognize that the present moment, this time, is not all there is. But rather we look forward to the fullness of hope in which Christ comes again, and the fullness of His law and His joy is made evident in all of us. We have an ever-present hope in times of trouble. And this is why he says in that verse, we should be patient in our suffering, and we should be persevering in our prayer. We should continue to recognize that even though now things are difficult, we're able to carry with us hope that takes us beyond the moment, takes us beyond now. Now, as we think about how that has an impact in the love that we have for one another, is that we realize that we do suffer with each other now. But we look forward to the day, the fullness of that hope in which God's glory will be revealed in each and every one of us. And because we have that hope, we are willing and able to suffer with each other, to endure the difficult times, to persevere in times of suffering, because we know that this world is not all that there is, that there is glory to come, and we can trust God with our lives. The third way in which love should affect us as a church is that it should affect our resources. So here he says in verse 13, we should contribute to the needs of the saints and extend hospitality to the strangers. Contributing to the needs of the saints is not talking about, the holiest holy persons, the saints. In Paul's writing, he describes all of those who believe as saints, those who have trusted God with their lives. And he's saying we should extend and contribute to the needs that we have with one another. We see this evidence in the early church, when it says that the church came together and nobody was without something to provide for their needs. In fact, it says of the church that some people went and they sold property. They sold their cars. They sold, they didn't have cars today, but they sold what they needed to in order to provide something, some gift, to give to people who had nothing, so that everybody had something to share. We are called as Christians, if true love is supposed to be the character of the church, it should not just affect our heads and our hearts. Somehow we need to let it sink down into our pocketbook a little bit, right? Allow us to freely care for the needs that we have with one another. I've seen churches where during the offering time, right before, there's actually a question that's raised. Does anybody have any material needs? And somebody might raise their hand and say, I have a neighbor who's come into my house and we need a bed. We don't have a bed in our house and we need somebody to do that. And somebody else in the church will say, I have a spare bed that's been in my garage for 20 years and I'm willing to bring that out so you can have it. And somebody might say, I have a problem because, we have a stove that's broken in and we don't know how to fix it. And somebody says, I'm a repairman. I know how to fix that stove and I'll be willing to contribute my time to care for that need. Now this is the way that the church can care for each other, is how do we share in those needs with one another. So he calls us to allow for our attitudes to change, our concept of how we use our time to change, and then finally for us to change in our understanding of our own resources. Interesting thing about this concept of resources, too, is that God uses this very avenue as a way of testing the measure of how much we love Christ. He does this by sending persons into our church community to test whether or not we are really willing to care. I think of the scriptures in Peter and Hebrews, where it says the church who was providing for the strangers had somehow unawares to their own minds, had entertained angels into their midst, and had by that way received blessing that they had not even been aware of. How does the church continue to demonstrate faithfulness to God through its resources and caring for the least of these? What's interesting is this idea of the stranger is that God has, through Scripture, always shown Himself to be the stranger. The one who shows up to Abraham as a stranger looking for bread, and Abraham brings him into the house and gives him food and pancakes for breakfast. I think that's a great story. But then God always shows up to the prophets as a stranger, and based on their hospitality is whether or not they receive the message that God has for them. As a church, without the ability to demonstrate hospitality and care for the stranger among us, we miss out on the greater calling of God to participate in His love for the world. Finally, love should affect our actions. He says we should rejoice with those who rejoice, and we are to weep with those who weep. This idea of love being able to move us into an empathetic relationship with somebody else. How much does it matter if you are in the midst of your trouble? Perhaps you have just experienced some bad news from the hospital, to have somebody who's willing to enter into that pain with you, who's willing to cry with you. I remember when I was in the hospital as a chaplain intern, and I walked into a room and there was some rejoicing happening. I assumed that with all the smiles and the laughter that was happening, that they had seen good news. And I thought, this is going to be a great visit. I'm going to go in and we're going to have a happy time together. And I walk in and they said, "Hey, chaplain, how's it going?" I said, "Pretty good. How's it going here? Sounds like you guys are doing pretty well." And they go, "Well, we just found out he's about to die." And I was like, what's going on here? But they told me their story, and they helped me realize that it had been about 5 years that this man had been suffering, and they hadn't known what it was that was affecting him, and he had put his life into account, and he had put all these things together, and he was rejoicing with his family, that they knew what was wrong, what was going on in his life, but he was also giving his final parting joy to his family. He's saying, because I love you, I want to make sure you have these things. And he was telling them what he was giving them as he was departing, and there was joy and there was laughter in the room. And that caused me all sorts of consternation as to how I was supposed to enter into it as a chaplain. But I rejoiced with the family, and I prayed with them, and entered into both their joy and those moments of sorrow. As Christ, we are called to walk into the moments of each other's lives. And when somebody is rejoicing, to celebrate with them. The birth of a newborn child, a new event that's happening in their life, or some good news. I found a quarter on the street. We rejoice with each other, and we celebrate even the small things together. But we also are called to grieve with others who also grieve. As a church, we have a chance to empathetically create that relationship with each other. Secondly, he says we are to not be haughty. We're supposed to put aside our own pride, our own sense of our importance, our arrogance of who we're supposed to be, but rather we're supposed to be willing to associate with those who are around us, those who are of low degree, those who are having trouble. And that's always a trouble for us. How do we walk into a situation and be willing to put ourselves aside so that we can then get into a relationship with those who we might otherwise not want to be in a relationship with? You know, Christ did that for us. I think that all of these things can be summarized as, why don't we try to live like Jesus a little bit? It can be summarized that way. You know, Jesus, who comes from the highest heaven sent by God to live in the squalor of earth, he comes and is born in a manger. You know, the manger is where the sheep eat, right? And that's if they had a manger. And his family slept in the place where all the cattle were. I can't imagine that being very clean. You know, Jesus being willing to walk through the muck and the mire of this world. And now he's asking us, are you going to care for the person next to you who's maybe of a little lesser degree? Maybe a little lesser status? Maybe they don't earn as much money as you do? But maybe that's somebody who God has called you to care for? Put it this way, God is willing to go from the highest heaven to earth to walk with us. Are we willing to cross the street or even the aisle to meet somebody else, to care about their needs? This finally gets to this capstone in Paul's description where he's saying that ultimately our ability to love is measured in our response to evil. Those persons who aren't just happenstance around us that cause us trouble, but persons who are purposefully out to seek your harm. Those are the persons who says, once we figured out how we are to love each other, now we have to figure out how we're going to love those persons who don't like us. And he describes it this way: in our response to those who are in evil, we are not to respond in that same way. So as I was describing with the kids, you know, if somebody calls you a booger, you're not supposed to call them a booger back. He says evil for evil only provides the result of having what? Everyone is blind and everyone is dumb. Right, at the end of that. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth leads everyone to be blind and everyone speechless. The response of the Christian is to respond to times of evil that have been incurred against us with kindness. And he uses the famous phrase, he says, in this way we recognize that God is the judge. God is the one who's going to bring the vengeance. So don't worry about it. Don't feel like you have to be the police, the judge, the jury. God is the one who's going to do all that. But instead, show kindness, and in this way, you heap burning coals upon their head. Now, some of you are like, yeah, they got it. They finally get their comings, right, for what's going to them. But what's used here is an interesting phrase. It's the same phrase that was used when the Israelites left out of Egypt. And one of the things that happened when they left out of Egypt was that the Egyptians who they were living with gave to the Israelites their gold, pewter, their bronze, their earrings and everything else. Sometimes they were cast with the images of the gods of Egypt. And as the Israelites kept hold of this jewelry, which of course had some worth, they needed to melt it down so that it could be transformed from an image of idolatry into being something useful that they could use. In a sense, it was a time of purification from this pagan practice in order to be used for God's promises. He's leading His people into the Holy Land. And so the idea of casting or heaping burning coals upon the heads, it was talking about pouring boring coals upon the heads of the idols so that they might be melted, so that they could be transformed. The idea for us as Christian believers is as we face those who might come against us, our kindness helps to transform and to melt the hearts of those who are against us. Because really, the only way you can transform an enemy into a friend is through kindness. And the only way an enemy stops becoming an enemy is when they truly become your friend. The end result for the Christian isn't just armistice, where there's no more war, there's no more fighting. The end result for the Christian isn't just peace. The true peace results when I am now befriending those who were formerly my enemy. It goes beyond. And so Paul says this way, we must truly demonstrate love for one another. When we finally recognize the fullness of God's love for us, we recognize that when we're able to care not just for each other as the church, but that love should be exhibited out into the world so that all people might know the love of Christ. This, of course, is truly challenging and difficult to take hold of in our lives. But we take it one step at a time. And I want to leave you with this story. This is called The Kiss. And this is from Moral Lessons from Richard Seltzer. He describes a physician as he's standing beside the bed of a woman who he had just done surgery with. He says, I stand by the bed where the one young woman lies. Her face, post-operative, her mouth was twisted in palsy, clownish. A tiny twig of the facial nerve, one of the muscles of her mouth has been severed. She will be that way from now on. I had followed with religious fervor the curve of her flesh. I promise you that. Nevertheless, to remove the tumor that was in her cheek, I had to cut that small nerve for her lips. Her young husband was in the room. He stands on the opposite side of her bed, and together they seem to be in a world all of their own, even in an evening lamplight, which is isolated from me. They are in a private space, all of their own. Who are they, I ask? He and this wry mouth that I have made, who gaze and look at each other so generously. The young woman speaks and asks me, will my mouth be like this always? Yes, I say, it will. It's because I had to cut that nerve to your lips. She nods and is silent. But the young man smiles. He says, I like it. It's kind of cute. And all at once the physician says, I know who he is, and I understand, and I lower my gaze. He is not bold in that encounter with the divine. Unmindful, he bends to kiss his bride. With her crooked mouth, the physician says he is close enough to see how he twists his own lips to accommodate hers, to show her that their kiss still works. What a beautiful expression of love. As a church, we recognize we're all broken people. We've all made a mess of our lives in one way or another. God calls us, as we have experienced His love, to find some way, even a small measured response, to give that kiss of love to one another. I invite you as we stand and singing response, one body, as we prepare for communion.